The ambulances didn't come one at a time. They came in a convoy, 7 vehicles, lights strobing red and white through the Montana dark, engines screaming so loud the waiting room windows rattled in their frames. The doors blew open and the soldiers hit the floor rolling, some of them already gray in the face, some of them missing things that couldn't be replaced. The trauma team at Harlow Creek Regional Medical Center froze for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds that felt like a year. And in that gap, while the chief surgeon stood at the edge of the chaos trying to remember how to move, a nurse, nobody had ever taken seriously, walked past him without a word, dropped to her knees beside the worst of them, and went to work like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the end. Hit follow so you don't miss a single part. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. Her name was Joanna Reyes, and she was nobody's idea of impressive. That was the general consensus at Harlow Creek Regional, a 340-bed trauma center serving the rural sprawl of Denton County in western Montana, a region where winters came early and stayed too long, and the hospital budget was always 6 months behind where it needed to be. The staff parking lot had a pothole that had been there for 3 years. The break room microwave sparked if you ran it over 4 minutes. These were the kinds of details that accumulated into a feeling, and the feeling at Harlow Creek was that nothing here was quite good enough, which made it easy to extend that judgment to the people working inside it. Joanna had been there 14 months. She was 28 years old. She was quiet in a way that people sometimes confused with emptiness. She showed up early, left when her shift ended, rarely talked about herself, and had a habit of standing slightly apart from groups, close enough to participate, far enough to leave. Her coworkers had tried to include her in the first couple of months. Lunch invitations, a birthday card signed by the nursing floor. The usual gestures. She'd accepted them politely and offered very little back, and eventually people stopped extending themselves and started filling in the silence with their own explanations. "She thinks she's better than us," said Dana Whitmore, a senior floor nurse with 12 years at Harlow Creek and an opinion on everyone. Dana said this in the break room in November, loud enough that 3 other nurses heard it and nodded. "She's from somewhere else, and she acts like it." Nobody pushed back. It was easier to agree, and agreement required nothing. The truth was more complicated than Dana Whitmore would ever know. But that's the nature of people who summarize other people quickly. They get the shape right sometimes and miss everything underneath. What they saw, a quiet blonde nurse with medium build and steady hands, who never raised her voice, never joked around, and sometimes stared at emergency patients with an intensity that seemed almost clinical, like she was running calculations nobody had asked her to run. What they didn't see, the 6 years before Harlow Creek, the places she'd been, the things she'd done inside them. She'd taken the job here deliberately. Denton County was remote. It was unglamorous. It paid less than what she could have gotten in Billings or Missoula, and the commute from her rented house on Route 9 was 40 minutes each way through nothing but open road and frozen fields. She'd wanted all of that. She'd wanted quiet and distance, and a place where her history didn't follow her through the door every morning. For 14 months, she'd had it. The chief of trauma surgery at Harlow Creek Regional was Dr. Marcus Holt, and the first thing you needed to understand about him was that he was genuinely talented. That part was real. He had finished his residency in the top third of his class at a program in Denver, had moved through his career with consistent competence, and had arrived in Denton County 6 years ago with ambitions that had since been scaled down by reality but not entirely extinguished. He was 43. He was respected by his peers, decisive under pressure, and capable of moments of real brilliance in the OR. The second thing you needed to understand was that he protected his authority the way some people protected money, reflexively, with a low-grade anxiety that never fully went away. He had a specific radar for anyone who might diminish it, and that radar had been pointed at Joanna Reyes since her 3rd week at Harlow Creek, when she'd flagged a post-op patient's vitals pattern at the start of a shift and predicted, accurately as it turned out, that the man was heading toward cardiac arrest. She'd been right by 2 hours. Holt had been the one to respond when the code called, and he had not thanked her or acknowledged her flag or mentioned her name in the incident report. He'd just looked at her in the hallway afterward with an expression she'd learned to read because she'd seen versions of it before in other hospitals, in other environments, in places far less comfortable than this one. And what it said was, "Don't make a habit of that." She hadn't pushed. She never pushed. She documented what needed documenting, did her job, and went home. But the dynamic had been set, and Holt reinforced it steadily over the following months in the small ways that people in authority use when they want to hold someone in place without admitting that's what they're doing. He talked over her in team meetings. He assigned her the least complex cases on overnight rotations, then cited the uncomplicated outcomes as evidence that she was suited to routine work. When she offered assessments during trauma consultations, he would listen with a patience that was really just a performance of patience, then redirect the room towards someone else's input. "You're a floor nurse, Reyes," he'd told her once, in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2, in a tone that managed to sound both reasonable and final. "There's a chain of command here. It exists for a reason." "I understand," she'd said. "Good." He'd moved on. She had gone back to her station and updated a patient chart and thought about nothing in particular for a long time. The other nurses watched this dynamic with the particular discomfort of people who recognize something is wrong but have decided the cost of saying so is too high. Dana Whitmore watched it and privately felt vindicated. If Holt didn't think much of Joanna Reyes, then Dana had been right all along, and Dana liked being right. A younger nurse named Priya Okafor watched it and felt bad about it, and had started to say something to Joanna once, in the parking lot after a long shift, before stopping herself. She wasn't sure what she would have said. Joanna didn't seem to need the conversation. That was the strange thing. She absorbed the treatment without visible damage, not with resentment, not with defeat, just with a steadiness that was either very healthy or a very effective disguise for something else. The truth was somewhere between the two. It was a Tuesday in late January when the call came in. Joanna was in the middle of a routine medication round on the second floor when the hospital-wide alert triggered, a sound she'd heard before in other contexts, in other languages, in other kinds of buildings, and which her body recognized the same way every time. A faint drop in temperature at the back of her neck, a brief stillness, then the shift into a different kind of focus. The intercom said, "Mass casualty alert. All available trauma staff to the emergency department. Repeat. Mass casualty alert." She capped the medication cart, confirmed her current patient was stable, and walked to the stairwell. Not ran. Walked. Her pace was measured and specific, the way you move when you know that the first thing you need to conserve is your own composure, because composure is a resource and resources run out. She heard the ambulances before she reached the ground floor. 7 of them, the way it turned out, though she didn't count them initially. She counted the sounds, the doors, the shouted reports coming through the entrance, and made a running estimate of patient load while she was still in the stairwell before she could see anything. She pushed through the door and entered the ER. What she found was organized chaos in the process of becoming disorganized. 7 military ambulances had offloaded 17 patients in under 6 minutes, which was more than Harlow Creek's trauma department had processed in any single event in its recent history. The triage nurses were doing their best, but the system wasn't built for this, and the gaps were already showing. 2 of the stretchers had been pushed against the wall where there was no staff attending. A third patient was conscious and trying to sit up with what Joanna could see from 15 feet away was a penetrating chest injury, which meant he was running on adrenaline and not much else, and when the adrenaline went, he was going to go with it. She moved toward him first. She was halfway there when a hand landed on her shoulder. Not grabbing, but firm, the kind of touch that expects compliance. "Get back to your station," said the voice. "We need the floor clear." She turned. It was Holt. He was wearing his trauma gown, but it was untied at the back, which meant he'd been moving fast and hadn't stopped to secure it, which meant his own composure was already under pressure, and the situation was younger than 4 minutes. "That patient has a tension pneumo developing," she said, and pointed. He didn't look where she pointed. "I said clear the floor, Reyes. You're not trauma certified for mass casualty events. Let the team work." "He has maybe 6 minutes before that escalates to cardiac arrest. I will assess my patients." The firmness in his voice had moved into something harder. "You are not a physician. You don't direct my team and you don't diagnose my patients. Go back upstairs." She held his gaze for 1 second. Just one. Then she went around him. Not aggressively, not dramatically. She simply redirected herself, the way water redirects around a stone, and crossed the remaining 10 feet to the patient with the chest injury, and when she reached him, she found exactly what she'd predicted. Uneven breath sounds, tracheal deviation starting, skin that had gone from pale to the specific gray-white that meant the body was already beginning to compensate for something that couldn't be compensated for much longer. She called for a needle decompression kit. A supply nurse looked at her, then looked at Holt, then looked back at her. "Get it," Joanna said, and her voice was quiet and completely certain, which was different from loud and commanding, and the supply nurse responded to the certainty because humans tend to move toward what sounds like it knows what it's doing. She had the kit in her hands 30 seconds later. Behind her, she heard Holt say her name. Then she heard him stop, because at that moment, across the room, one of the soldiers who had been triaged and set aside, one of the ones against the wall, went into full cardiac arrest, and that pulled Holt's attention the way it had to, because regardless of his feelings about Joanna Reyes, he was a physician, and that was his patient. She worked on the chest injury. She performed the decompression procedure with the efficiency of someone doing something they have done before, under circumstances that were significantly worse than this. The soldier's breathing changed almost immediately. The quality of it, the volume, the effort. And she pressed her hand against his arm once, briefly, and he looked at her with the specific expression of someone who has just realized they are not, in fact, going to die right now. "You're going to be okay," she said. "Stay still." She moved to the next one. The next 90 minutes were the longest of Priya Okafor's 3-year nursing career, and based on what she described to her husband afterward, the most disturbing and the most clarifying. She watched Joanna Reyes work through the mass casualty event with a control that did not fit the category of floor nurse in any definition Priya had encountered. She watched her stop arterial bleeding with manual pressure and a tourniquet applied so fast it took Priya a moment to register that it had happened. She watched her assess an unconscious soldier's Glasgow score in under 30 seconds, call the number to a resident who was still checking his reference card, and be correct. She watched her prioritize patients in a way that looked instinctive but was actually systematic, a system Priya recognized after a moment as the military triage framework, which was not the same framework they used at Harlow Creek Regional and was not something you learned in a standard nursing curriculum. She watched Marcus Holt across the room, watching all of this. His expression cycled through several things: irritation, disbelief, something that was starting to look like grudging attention, then something else that was harder to read, something that lived in the territory between humiliation and fear. He crossed the room at one point when Joanna was stabilizing a patient with a compromised airway and stood behind her with his arms at his sides. "You need to stop this," he said. She did not stop. She finished securing the airway, confirmed breath sounds bilaterally, and then straightened and turned to face him. "4 of your patients in the left bay are going to need additional assessment in the next 10 minutes, she said. "The one in Bay 3 has a femoral bleed that the pressure dressing isn't going to hold." "You are a floor nurse," he said, and each word was its own sentence, evenly spaced. "You are not authorized to—" "Bay 3, she said, and moved. He grabbed her arm. Not hard, but he grabbed it. She stopped walking and looked at his hand on her arm, and then she looked at his face, and whatever she found there, or whatever he found in hers, made him release it. "Security," he said to the room. "I need security in the trauma bay." The room kept moving. The nurses kept working. A resident near the door looked up and then looked back down at his patient. Priya watched, her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the mass casualty event and everything to do with what she was watching happen between these two people. "Dr. Holt," said a voice. Wendy Cass, the charge nurse, a woman with 20 years of experience and a reliable instinct for when a situation was about to go sideways. "We have a critical in Bay 6. Holt didn't move for a moment. Then he turned and went to Bay 6. The security guard arrived 4 minutes later, a heavy-set man named Burton, who Joanna knew slightly from the overnight shifts, a decent person who was now visibly uncertain about what he was supposed to do. "Ma'am," he said, "Dr. Holt asked me to... There's a patient in Bay 3 with a failing pressure dressing on a femoral injury," Joanna said. She was pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. "Either someone goes to Bay 3 right now, or that patient goes into hypovolemic shock in approximately 4 minutes. That's the situation. Burton looked at Bay 3. He looked at Joanna. He looked at the rest of the room, which was still churning with controlled emergency. Let me get Dr. Holt, he said. Good idea, said Joanna, and went to Bay 3 herself. The pressure dressing failed 90 seconds later, exactly as she'd predicted. She managed the bleed manually until a resident got there, talked the resident through the next steps with a specificity that made him follow her instructions without thinking to question them, and then stepped back when the situation was controlled. Burton was still standing near the entrance. He didn't ask her to leave again. 2.5 hours into the event, the pace began to shift. The critical cases had been identified and addressed. The patients who were going to survive had a better odds profile than they'd had at the start. The residents were tired but functioning. The department had absorbed something it hadn't been built for and hadn't entirely fallen apart. Joanna was in the supply room refilling a cart when Dana Whitmore came in. Dana stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at Joanna. She looked at the cart. She looked at the floor. Nobody's saying you didn't do okay, Dana said, but you realize you made him look terrible out there. Joanna kept restocking the cart. Saline, gauze, pressure dressings. He had the situation covered, Dana continued, though her tone had less conviction now than it usually did. He didn't need you going around him like that. Okay, Joanna said. You're going to have real problems after tonight. You know that, right? Joanna looked at her. Dana was not a bad person. She was a person who had spent 12 years in a place that rewarded deference to authority and had optimized herself accordingly. And now she couldn't always tell the difference between loyalty and complicity. That happened to people. It was not unusual. I know, Joanna said. Thanks for telling me. Dana seemed to want something else from that exchange, an argument maybe, or an admission, or something she could report back. She didn't get it. She left. Joanna finished restocking the cart. At 6:47 a.m., with the trauma department approaching something resembling equilibrium, Marcus Holt found her in the hallway outside the nursing station. He had composed himself. She could see the effort of it, the set of his jaw, the deliberate calm in his posture, the way he'd organized his expression into something that was trying to be professional authority and landing slightly short. I need to talk to you, he said. Okay? What you did tonight... He paused, restarted. I understand that you believed you were helping, but you circumvented my authority in front of my entire team, in the middle of a crisis, in a way that I cannot allow to stand without consequence. You understand that? She looked at him. He was waiting for something, an apology probably, or at least an acknowledgement that he had the power to make this difficult for her. How many of those soldiers made it through? She asked. He blinked. That's not how many? The number was 15 out of 17. 2 had died, 1 on arrival, 1 within the first 20 minutes, both from injuries that nothing in any emergency department could have reversed. The other 15 were alive. Holt didn't answer her question. He didn't need to. She already knew. Your conduct was insubordinate and potentially dangerous, he said. I'm filing a formal incident report and recommending a review of your employment status here. Pending that review, you're suspended from trauma rotation effective immediately. She absorbed that. There was a beat of quiet. Understood, she said. You can go home. She pulled off her gloves and dropped them in the waste container on the wall. She gathered her things from the nursing station, clocked out at the terminal, and walked toward the exit. She was almost at the doors when she heard the sound. The hospital entrance sliding open. The sound of boots on tile. Not the soft-soled movement of medical staff. Something different, heavier, more deliberate. She turned. 3 figures in military uniform had entered the lobby. They were speaking to the front desk receptionist, who was pointing back toward the trauma department, and then one of them, the one in the middle, with insignia on his collar that Joanna's eyes read automatically before her brain had time to decide whether it wanted to, turned and scanned the room, the way soldiers scan rooms quickly and completely until they find the specific thing they're looking for. His eyes stopped on her wrist. She looked down. The combat medical band she'd been wearing since the last deployment, worn from habit mostly, a piece of nylon that cost nothing and meant more than she'd ever said to anyone here, was visible below her sleeve cuff where she'd pushed it up during the night. The officer in the middle took 2 steps in her direction and stopped. He was a colonel, full bird, the kind of rank that doesn't travel to a regional trauma center in western Montana at 7 in the morning unless something significant is happening. He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you the one who ran the trauma response tonight?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. In the space of that pause, she was aware of Marcus Holt standing somewhere behind her. She'd heard him follow her out. And of the receptionist watching, and of the 2 officers flanking the colonel who were standing with the particular stillness of people waiting for something they already know is coming. "I assisted with several patients," she said. The colonel looked at the band on her wrist. Then he looked at her face. He already knew. She could see that he already knew, the same way she'd already known. The second he walked through those doors, that this night was not going to end the way she'd expected when she drove to work 16 hours ago. "We need to speak with you," he said. "If you have a moment." Behind her she heard Marcus Holt say something, her name probably, or a version of it delivered with the authority of someone who was still operating under the assumption that he controlled what happened next in this hallway. The colonel's eyes moved to Holt. They stayed there for exactly as long as it took to assess the situation, which was not very long at all. "This is a military matter," the colonel said to Holt, in a tone that was not unkind but was entirely absolute. "We appreciate your team's work tonight." Holt stopped talking. The colonel looked back at Joanna. "There are men in that department," he said, "who are alive right now because of what happened in there. I'd like to understand who made that happen." The lobby was very quiet. The fluorescent lights above the reception desk had the particular buzz they always had in the early morning when the building felt emptied out and temporary. Outside, the first gray light of a Montana winter dawn was beginning to push through the glass. Joanna Reyes looked at the colonel. She looked at the insignia on his collar. She looked at the band on her wrist. 14 months of quiet. 14 months of not being seen, not being considered, not being taken seriously by the people in this building. 14 months of stay out of decisions above your pay grade, and you're not authorized, and you're just a floor nurse, delivered in small doses that were calibrated to maintain a particular order. "I have a moment," she said. The colonel's name was Warren Briggs, and he had the kind of face that had stopped being easy to read about 20 years ago. Not cold, exactly, but sealed in the way that men get sealed when they've spent enough time in rooms where showing too much costs too much. He was 51. Built solid without being large, with gray at both temples and the kind of posture that didn't require effort anymore. He gestured toward the family consultation room off the main lobby, a small room with 4 chairs, a round table, and a box of tissues on the windowsill that nobody ever moved, and held the door for her. She went in. He followed. The 2 officers with him stayed outside in the hallway. He didn't sit immediately. He stood at the window and looked out at the parking lot for a moment, at the ambulances that were still parked in a line along the curb, their lights off now, the drivers somewhere inside getting coffee or being debriefed. 17 men came in tonight, he said, without turning around. 15 are going to make it. The hospital staff did a lot of that. He paused. But the first 40 minutes were the difference. That's not a small thing. Joanna sat in the chair nearest the door. Not because she was planning to leave, but because it was the position that let her see both the door and him, and old habits don't ask permission before they settle back in. "I did what needed doing," she said. "I know you did." He turned then. "I also know why you know how to do it." The room went quiet. The heater in the corner ticked. She looked at him and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He sat down across from her, and when he did, some of the formality went out of his posture. Not completely, but enough to change the temperature of the room slightly. "Your name came up about 6 hours ago," he said. "We were tracking the patient transport routes, looking at facility capacity. When I saw which hospital the convoy was heading to, I ran the staff roster. It's a standard check. We look for people with relevant backgrounds when we're routing into unfamiliar facilities." He folded his hands on the table. "Joanna Reyes, 6-year service record, 3 deployments, attached to the 92nd Special Operations Support Command, medic qualification level 4. She didn't flinch. There wasn't much point in flinching at facts. "That's a matter of record," she said. "It is." He studied her. What's not a matter of record is what you did with those qualifications in the last 2.5 hours. But I saw enough when I walked in. He glanced at the door, toward the trauma department, somewhere beyond the lobby wall. The surgeon out there, Holt. He's a good physician, she said. The statement was true. It was also incomplete, and she didn't add to it. Is he going to be a problem? She thought about that, about the incident report, about the suspension from trauma rotation, about the way he'd looked at her when the colonel had redirected him in the hallway, not angry anymore, which would have been manageable, but something smaller than that, and smaller was sometimes worse. Probably, she said. Briggs nodded like he'd expected that answer. He pulled a card from his breast pocket and set it on the table between them. It had a number on it and nothing else. There are things happening that I'm not in a position to brief you on right now. Not here, not this morning. But I want you to know that what you did tonight was seen. He stood. By people who understand what they were looking at. She looked at the card. She didn't pick it up yet. What kind of things, Briss? She said. He was already at the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back. The kind that don't stay contained, he said. Get some rest. And then he was gone, and she was alone in the consultation room with a business card and the heater ticking and the sound of the hospital settling back into its daytime rhythms somewhere beyond the walls. She picked up the card. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket and walked out. The suspension letter arrived in her employee inbox at 9:14 a.m., officially worded HR processed, citing conduct unbecoming of a non-physician medical staff member and pending review of employment status. She read it on her phone in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the heat running. The letter referenced the chain of command 3 times in 4 paragraphs, which told her everything about who had drafted the language. She drove home. The house on Route 9 was a rental, single story, 2 bedrooms, more space than she needed and less warmth than she would have liked, though she'd done what she could with it over 14 months. She'd put up shelves in the 2nd bedroom. She'd fixed the kitchen faucet herself in October when the property manager stopped returning calls. There was a rug in the living room that she'd bought at a closing sale in town, burgundy with a geometric border, and sometimes when she walked in the front door she noticed it first thing and it gave her a small, specific feeling of having done something right. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with it. She did not immediately do anything. The problem with moving quietly through a crisis, she'd learned over the years, was that the quiet didn't last. You could manage yourself through the worst of it and feel nothing much at the time, and then afterward the body sent the bill. She sat with her coffee and let whatever needed to come through. A low-grade tremor in her hands, a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with injury, a sudden and vivid memory of Bay 3 that she watched pass through her mind without fighting it. 15 soldiers were alive. That was the number that mattered. The rest of it was noise. She drank her coffee, ate something, and slept for 4 hours. She woke at 2 in the afternoon to 3 missed calls. 2 from a number she didn't recognize, 1 from Priya Okafor. She called Priya back first. Priya answered on the 2nd ring and immediately sounded like someone who had been holding something in for several hours and was relieved to have a container for it. I heard about the suspension, she said. Joanna, I'm so sorry. It's fine, Joanna said. It's not fine. What happened in there last night, the way you... Priya stopped, restarted. I've been a nurse for 3 years, and I've never seen anyone work like that. Where did you... I know you don't talk about it, but Priya. Yeah. Is everyone okay there? The patients? A pause. 14 of the 15 are stable or improving. 1 is still in the ICU, but they're optimistic. Another pause. Shorter. Joanna, Holt is telling people you went rogue, that you endangered patients by operating outside your scope. She'd expected something like this. The shape of it, anyway. What are people saying? Some believe him. Dana definitely believes him, or she's acting like she does. Priya's voice lowered slightly. But some of the residents saw what actually happened. The one in Bay 3, Kaminsky. He's been very quiet, but I overheard him telling someone that you diagnosed that situation before anyone else in the room was even oriented. He shouldn't be drawing attention to himself over it. He's not exactly doing it on purpose. I think he's just... Priya hesitated. I think he's trying to figure out what he saw. Joanna sat on the edge of her bed. Outside the window, the afternoon light was the flat white of winter in Montana, sourceless and even, the sky the same temperature as the ground. If anyone asks you directly what you observed, she said, be accurate, that's all. What are you going to do? She thought about the card in her jacket pocket, about Warren Briggs's voice when he'd said, the kind that don't stay contained. I don't know yet, she said. The unknown number called again at 4. This time she answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Professional, slightly guarded, the kind of voice that introduced itself by role rather than name. She was a senior investigator with the Army Inspector General's office, she said. She was calling because a flag had been placed on certain records connected to the previous evening's event. She was not in a position to give details over the phone. Would Joanna be willing to come in for a formal conversation at the National Guard facility in Landers, about 40 minutes south, at her earliest convenience? Tomorrow, Joanna said. That would be appropriate, yes, said the voice. Thank you. After she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment. She went to the closet and took down a box from the top shelf. Cardboard, reinforced, sealed with tape that had been applied years ago and hadn't been opened since. She put it on the bed and looked at it. She didn't open it. She put it back on the shelf. The Landers National Guard facility was a modest compound off Route 287, low brick buildings, a security gate, a flag that moved in the cold wind off the mountains. Joanna had driven past it dozens of times without registering it, the way you don't register things that aren't asking anything of you. The investigator was a major named Delphine Voss, late 30s, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of organized desk that suggested she did not have patience for inefficiency. She shook Joanna's hand and gestured to a seat with the economy of motion that military officials tend to develop, where every physical action communicates something. The room had a recorder on the table. Voss identified herself, the date, the purpose of the meeting. Then she set down a photograph. The photograph showed a man Joanna recognized, not from Harlow Creek, from before. Her expression didn't change, but Voss was watching her, not aggressively, but completely, and Joanna knew her recognition had registered, however small. Do you know him? Voss asked. I knew him, Joanna said. His name was Sergeant First Class Dario Keller. He was a medical operations coordinator. I worked with him on my second deployment. When did you last have contact with him? 3, maybe 3.5 years ago, before I left service. She looked up from the photograph. Why? Voss pulled the photograph back. Sergeant Keller died 8 weeks ago. The official cause of death was acute cardiac event. He was 34 years old. Joanna was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was doing something. He wasn't sick, she said. Not when I knew him. No, he wasn't. Voss folded her hands on the table. He's the third person from your unit's second deployment rotation to die in the past 11 months, the second with no prior history of cardiac disease. The room held that for a moment. You're saying it's not cardiac, Joanna said. I'm saying the pattern is unusual enough to warrant investigation. Voss was precise about her words. I'm also saying that you were one of the medical personnel attached to that deployment rotation, which makes you a person of interest in terms of what you may have observed or been aware of during that period. Joanna looked at the table. There was a ring on the surface where someone's coffee cup had sat too many times in the same spot. She focused on that for a second. What was the operation? She asked. What are we actually talking about? Voss held her gaze. I'm not in a position to name a classified operation in this setting. What I can tell you is that the investigation is active, that it extends to multiple agencies, and that the individuals who've died were all connected to one specific 3-week period during that deployment. Joanna knew which 3 weeks. She didn't say so yet. Who are the other 2? She asked. Voss named them. Both men. Both people Joanna had worked alongside. Not closely, but closely enough. The kind of people you know the way you know everyone in a confined deployment environment, their habits, their moods, their specific way of dealing with pressure. One of them had been good at his job. The other had been mediocre but reliable, which was its own kind of value. "What do you need from me?" she asked. At this stage, a voluntary statement about your recollection of events and personnel during that rotation. Nothing is binding at this point. You can have legal representation present if you choose. Voss paused. I'd also ask that you not discuss the details of this conversation with anyone outside this facility. Joanna nodded. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. She was careful with her words, not deceptive, not evasive, but precise. She stated what she knew with certainty and distinguished it clearly from what she'd inferred or suspected. She answered every question Voss asked. She did not volunteer anything she hadn't been asked for, not yet, because she understood that information offered before you understand the shape of an investigation can be misdirected. And she didn't want to give anything to the wrong people for the wrong reasons. When she left, the wind off the mountains had picked up. She sat in her car in the parking lot and breathed carefully for a few minutes before starting the engine. 3 people from that rotation were dead. She knew what had happened in those 3 weeks. She'd been there. She'd documented parts of it. She'd made a choice at the time, a choice she'd justified to herself with reasons that had seemed sound, that she'd thought about since, that still felt like a closed question most of the time and an open wound the rest of the time. She started the car and drove north on 287 toward home. The hospital called 2 days later. Not HR, not Holt. The call came from the office of the chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Sandra Achebe, who had been in the role for 2 years and who Joanna had interacted with exactly twice, both times in passing. Achebe's assistant asked if Joanna could come in for a meeting at 1 o'clock. She went. Achebe's office was on the 4th floor and had a window that looked out over the hospital's east parking structure. It was a working office, actual paperwork on the desk, 2 stacked manila folders on the credenza, a laptop open to a spreadsheet. Achebe herself was in her mid-50s, sharp-featured and direct in the way of someone who'd learned that directness saves time. She gestured Joanna to a chair and didn't make it a performance. "I've been reviewing the incident report from Tuesday morning," she said. "Dr. Holt's account and the formal nursing supervisor addendum. I've also spoken with 3 of the residents who were present." She looked at Joanna. "And I reviewed the patient outcomes." Joanna waited. 15 survivors out of 17 in a mass casualty event with that profile and that volume, Achebe said. "That's not a bad number." "No," Joanna agreed. "It's not. Dr. Holt's report characterizes your conduct as insubordinate and potentially dangerous. He uses the word rogue at one point." Achebe's tone was neutral, not unkind, but not sympathetic either. She was evaluating. "The residents' accounts suggest a different picture." "I worked within the scope of the situation," Joanna said carefully. "That's an interesting way to put it." Achebe tapped a pen against her desk twice. "It's also vague enough to mean almost anything. I'd like you to be more specific." So Joanna was specific. She described what she'd encountered when she arrived in the trauma bay. She named the patients, described the presentations, explained the decisions she'd made and the reasoning behind each one. She was matter-of-fact about it. No defensiveness, no editorial. And she watched Achebe's expression as she spoke, noting the places where the CMO's face shifted slightly. When she was done, Achebe was quiet for a moment. "Where did you train?" Achebe asked. "University of Colorado, BSN program." "And before that?" A beat. "I was in the Army." "In what capacity?" "Combat medic, 6 years." Achebe looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone reassessing an equation they thought they'd already solved. "That information isn't in your HR file," she said. "I didn't submit it." "Why not?" Joanna chose her words. "Because I wanted a job, not a reputation." Achebe set down the pen. She looked at the window, then back at Joanna. "Dr. Holt's suspension recommendation is going to be reviewed," she said. "I can't tell you the outcome of that review, and I wouldn't prejudge it regardless. But I want you to know that this office is aware of the full scope of what happened Tuesday morning." She paused. "I also want to ask you, plainly, is there anything in your background that this hospital should know about that might be relevant to your current role or to anything else that might be coming?" The question was more precise than it sounded, Joanna felt its edges. She thought about Voss, about the 3 names, about the 3 weeks. "I'm cooperating with an ongoing military investigation," she said. "I can't discuss the details, but you should be aware that it exists." Achebe's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "Are you in any kind of danger, Miss Reyes?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Joanna hadn't been asked that by anyone in months, maybe longer. She found, surprisingly, that she didn't immediately know how to answer it, not because the answer was complicated, but because she'd spent so long not thinking about it in those terms that the framing felt almost foreign. "I'm not sure," she said. "I think I'm becoming that way." Achebe looked at her for a long time. "Keep me informed," she said, "if anything changes." The message arrived on Thursday night, 11:30. Not a call. A text from a number that resolved to no contact when she searched it. The message was 6 words long. "We know you spoke to investigators." She read it once. Then she set the phone face down on the kitchen table and stood very still in the middle of her kitchen for almost a full minute. Then she picked the phone back up and called the number Voss had given her. It rang 4 times before connecting. Voss sounded alert, not sleepy. Either she kept unusual hours or she'd been expecting a call. "Reyes, I got a message tonight. Text. 6 words. She read it aloud. A pause. She heard Voss moving, the sound of a chair, something being placed on a hard surface. "Did you respond?" Voss asked. "No. Don't. Screenshot it, and don't delete the thread." Another pause. "Does anyone outside this facility know you came in on Wednesday?" She thought about it. She'd told no one. She'd driven her own car. She'd signed in at the gate with her ID. "No," she said. "Then someone accessed a record they shouldn't have." Voss's voice was measured, but Joanna could hear the thing underneath it. Not panic, but urgency recalibrated. "You need to be careful about your routine for the next several days. Vary your route to work. Don't go anywhere predictable late at night. If anything else comes in, anything at all, call me before you respond or engage." "Who knows I talked to you?" Joanna asked. "Who has access to that sign-in?" "That's what I'm going to find out tonight," Voss said. "Get some sleep if you can." She hung up. Joanna stood in her kitchen again. The refrigerator hummed. The burgundy rug was visible through the doorway to the living room, still there, still doing what it was supposed to do. She picked up her phone and looked at the message again. 6 words. Someone had seen her sign into a military facility, or someone had a source inside that facility. Either way, something that was supposed to be contained had already extended further than it was supposed to reach. And now they'd reached toward her specifically, not to threaten her physically, not yet, but to let her know that she was visible. That the quiet she'd cultivated here, the deliberate ordinariness of Route 9 and the Harlow Creek break room and the burgundy rug was not as solid as she'd been counting on. She went to the closet. She took the box down from the shelf. This time, she opened it. Inside were things she'd sealed away when she moved here. Her discharge papers, folded along a crease that had gone soft. A laminated copy of her medic certification. A photograph of a group of people in a place she didn't name to herself, taken in the specific flat light of a location she'd never described to anyone in Denton County. 2 small notebooks in army green covers, bound with a rubber band filled with handwriting that was tighter and faster than her current writing, because it had been written in conditions where there wasn't much time. She set the notebooks on her bed and didn't open them yet. She looked at the photograph for a long time. 3 of the people in it were dead. She was still here. She had not understood until this moment how precisely those 2 facts were connected. She picked up the notebooks. She sat down on the bed with them in her lap. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did in Montana in January, moving across the open land with nothing to stop it, pressing against the windows, finding the small places where the insulation had failed. Her phone lit up on the nightstand. Another text. Same number. This one was 4 words. Stay out of it. She stared at the screen. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. She put the phone down. She opened the first notebook. The handwriting in the first notebook was hers. but it felt like someone else's. Tighter, faster, written under conditions where slowing down wasn't an option. She'd forgotten how much she'd recorded. Dates, names, medical observations, the kind of documentation that a good medic keeps automatically, because documentation is the difference between an event that happened and an event that can be proven. She read through the first notebook in an hour and 40 minutes. Then she opened the second. By the time she finished, it was past 2 in the morning. She sat with the notebooks in her lap and the photograph on the bed beside her, and the wind still pressing at the windows. And she understood something she hadn't fully articulated to herself before tonight. She hadn't come to Denton County just to be quiet. She'd come here because some part of her had known, for 3 years, that what she'd witnessed during those 3 weeks was not finished, that it was sitting somewhere in the architecture of classified records and institutional silence, waiting for enough weight to accumulate before it collapsed. And she'd put herself at the edge of everything, remote, low profile, off the radar of anyone who might be watching, because she hadn't been ready for it to collapse yet. She wasn't sure she was ready now. But stay out of it was not a request you sent to someone who didn't matter. It was a request you sent to someone whose testimony could hurt you, which meant someone already knew exactly what she'd seen. She closed the second notebook and held it between both hands for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and sent Voss a message. "I need to come back in. I have documentation." She set the notebooks on the nightstand. She lay back on the bed without changing clothes. She didn't sleep much, but she'd functioned on less. Voss met her at the gate at 7:45 the next morning. Not the assistant this time, Voss herself, in a coat over her uniform, standing in the cold with the measured alertness of someone who had also not slept enough. She looked at the notebooks in Joanna's hand and then looked at her face. "You kept field notes," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I kept everything." Joanna handed them over. "I want copies made before you process them as evidence. I want to retain my copies." Voss didn't argue. She understood that Joanna was not handing over the notebooks as an act of pure cooperation. She was handing over a kind of insurance and asking for the receipt. "The messages," Voss said. "Did anything else come in?" "No, just the 2. Voss held the door open. "Come inside." The room they used this time was different, larger, with 2 other people in it. A man she hadn't seen before, civilian clothes but military bearing, introduced as Agent Rourke from a federal investigation division whose full title she wasn't given. A younger woman with a laptop who was introduced simply as Specialist Dara and who began photographing the notebooks within 2 minutes of Joanna sitting down. Rourke was the one who talked. He had a flat Midwestern accent and eyes that were doing constant arithmetic. He set a folder on the table and opened it to a page of names with dates beside them. 3 deceased, he said. Sergeant First Class Dario Keller, Staff Sergeant Max Pruitt, Warrant Officer Helen Tabor. He looked at Joanna. "You knew all 3. "Yes." All 3 were part of the medical observation team during the operation designated Gray Circuit. He watched her. "Are you familiar with that designation?" "Not by that name. We didn't use operation names in the field. We used grid references and date windows." The 3-week window in question would correspond to grid sector November 7, approximately 37 months ago. She knew the window. She didn't say it aloud yet. "What do you want to know specifically?" "Everything." He folded his hands. "But let's start with what you observed regarding civilian casualties during that period." The room went very still. Not theatrically, just the specific stillness of people who understand that what happens in the next hour matters. She told them. She spoke for 40 minutes. She was precise. She described what she'd seen during those 3 weeks in a sector that didn't officially appear on any mission summary she'd ever been given access to. The medical calls that didn't match the official timeline. The patients she'd treated who weren't supposed to be there. The documentation she'd been told to submit and the documentation she'd been told to revise. She described the moment she'd understood that the revisions were not corrections. They were erasures. She described the choice she'd made. She hadn't reported it then. She'd revised the documentation the way she'd been instructed, filed it, and spent the subsequent months trying to determine whether she'd done that because she believed it was the right call or because she'd been afraid of what happened to people who didn't. She'd never fully resolved that question. She didn't offer Rourke or Voss a clean answer to it, because there wasn't one. Rourke listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The documentation you submitted at the time, the revised version, was there anything you preserved from the original? She looked at the notebooks, which Specialist Dara had finished photographing, and returned to the table. The field notes predate the revisions, she said. Everything I observed went in the notebooks the same day. I revised the official reports because I was ordered to. I didn't revise the notebooks because no one knew they existed. Rourke looked at Voss. Voss looked at the notebooks. These are potentially significant, Rourke said, which was the most contained way she'd ever heard anyone describe something that was clearly the opposite of contained. I know, she said. That's why I kept them. Bon. They kept her for another 2 hours. She answered questions about specific personnel. Names she remembered, names she didn't. Descriptions of people she'd seen in that sector whose connection to the operation had never been explained to her. She described the medical officer who'd given her the revision instructions, a man named Colonel Terence Ardell, who she'd encountered twice and who had spoken to her with the particular authority of someone accustomed to instructions being followed without pushback. When she said Ardell's name, something changed in the room. Not dramatically. Rourke didn't react overtly, but Voss's pen, which had been moving, stopped. You're certain of that name, Rourke said. Yes. You interacted directly with Colonel Ardell. Twice. The first time was a group briefing. The second time was a one-on-one conversation where he told me the documentation parameters for the after-action reports. She paused. He was specific about what should and shouldn't appear in the final versions. Rourke closed the folder. He sat back. Ms. Reyes, he said, and his tone shifted slightly. Not toward softness, but toward something more serious, which she hadn't thought was possible. I want to be transparent with you about the scope of what you've just provided. Ardell is a senior figure in an ongoing federal investigation. Your testimony places you as a direct witness to his instructions. That makes you material to this case. I understand. It also means the messages you received are more significant than they might appear. Someone knows you're in contact with investigators, and if they know Ardell's name is potentially in play, then the people protecting him have a reason to contain this, she said. Yes. The words sat in the room without decoration. She looked at the notebooks. She thought about Dario Keller, who had been 34 and healthy, and whose heart had apparently decided to stop. About Max Pruitt and Helen Tabor. About the shape of 3 deaths in 11 months, all from the same 3-week window, all quiet, all attributed to causes that were individually plausible and collectively impossible. What happens now? She asked. We escalate internally, and we make arrangements for your safety. I'd like you to consider a temporary change in your living situation. No, she said it flatly. I'm not relocating. I have a job, mushy. Suspended currently, but that'll resolve. And I'm not disappearing from my life because someone sent me 2 text messages. Rourke looked at her. These aren't typical harassment messages. I know what they are. She held his gaze. What I need from you is to move fast enough that the messages stop being relevant. What I need is for this investigation to outrun whoever is sending them. A beat. That's the goal, Voss said. It doesn't happen overnight. Then let's stop spending time telling me to be careful and start spending it on Ardell. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face settled into a kind of recognition, the look of a person who has just understood the category they're dealing with. All right, he said. She drove home through flat winter light, the mountains a gray suggestion on the western horizon. Her hands were steady on the wheel. The thing she was feeling wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like the recalibration of stakes. The past 2 days had moved her from a situation she thought she understood into one with more exposure and more consequence. And the adjustment required wasn't emotional. It was operational. What do you know? What do you need? What moves first? She'd barely gotten through her front door when her phone rang. It was Priya. Something happened at the hospital, Priya said, and her voice was wrong. Not panicked, but compressed, the way voices get when someone is trying to keep control of information and their own reaction simultaneously. One of the soldiers from Tuesday, the one who was still in the ICU. Joanna stopped in the middle of her kitchen. What happened? He crashed an hour ago. They got him back, but it was... Joanna, it wasn't cardiac. The resident who responded said the presentation was wrong. The whole pattern was wrong. Priya was keeping her voice low. She was clearly still at the hospital. They're saying it's a complication from his initial injuries, but Kaminsky pulled me aside 20 minutes ago and said he wasn't sure. He said the deterioration pattern didn't match the injury profile. Joanna's jaw tightened. Which patient? Corporal named Reyes. He was Bay 6. She remembered Bay 6. She remembered the patient. She'd spent 8 minutes stabilizing him during the worst of the intake. A blast injury, mostly soft tissue, blood loss managed, prognosis reasonable given the initial severity. Where is he now? Still in the ICU. They've stabilized him again for now. Is there anyone with him? Military? There was a liaison officer here earlier. I don't know if he's still in the building. She thought about Rourke's face when she'd said Ardell, about 3 names on a list, about the specific arithmetic of someone eliminating witnesses, and how that arithmetic would extend to anyone who had been part of the event that started this chain. Priya, she said, I need you to do something for me. Don't ask me to explain it right now. A pause. Okay. Find Kaminsky. Tell him that any anomalous presentation in that patient needs to be documented exactly as observed, not interpreted through the injury record. Verbatim observations, time-stamped. She paused. And tell him to make sure those notes go somewhere besides the standard chart. Another pause, longer this time. Joanna, what's going on? I'll explain when I can. Will you do it? Yes, Priya said. Yeah, I will. She hung up and immediately called Voss. Voss picked up on the first ring this time. One of the soldiers from the mass casualty event just had an anomalous deterioration, Joanna said. ICU patient, Harlow Creek. Corporal Reyes. The resident on scene flagged the presentation as inconsistent with the injury profile. Silence on the other end. Then, you think it's connected? I think 3 people from my deployment rotation are dead, and now one of the 17 soldiers from Tuesday is crashing in a way that doesn't make sense to the physician who's looking at him, and I'd like very much to be wrong about what that means. Give me 20 minutes, Voss said. Don't go to the hospital. I'm not authorized to be there. I mean it, Reyes. Stay away until I've made some calls. She stood in her kitchen. She looked at the rug in the other room. She looked at the window. She picked up her keys. She didn't go inside right away. She parked 2 rows back in the hospital lot and sat with the engine off and watched the entrance. It was a hospital in the middle of the afternoon. A steady, low-level flow of people in and out, nothing obviously wrong. A food delivery truck blocking one of the side exits. A man in civilian clothes standing near the ambulance bay, not doing anything in particular, which was the specific posture of someone doing something in particular. She watched him for 4 minutes. He didn't smoke, didn't check his phone, didn't look at the entrance. He looked at the parking lot. He was looking for a car, or a person arriving by car. She felt the back of her neck go cold. She pulled out her phone and texted Voss. Someone at the ambulance bay entrance, civilian clothes, standing, watching the lot. Not staff. Voss's reply came back in 90 seconds. Do not get out of your car. Local law enforcement is 3 minutes away. Stay on the line. She put Voss on speaker and set the phone on the passenger seat. She kept her eyes on the man by the ambulance bay. He shifted his weight once. He glanced at his watch. Her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She looked at it. Voss's voice from the speaker said, Reyes, don't answer that. I see it. 3 minutes. The man by the ambulance bay straightened slightly. His eyes moved, not toward her car specifically, but toward the lot entrance, the way you look when you're expecting a vehicle. She looked in her rearview mirror. A dark SUV had turned into the lot and was moving slowly down her row. Too slowly. Voss, she said, I hear you. 2 minutes. The SUV was 3 cars back and coming. She did the math automatically. If she got out of the car, she was visible in the lot. If she stayed in the car, she was contained. The man by the ambulance bay was 60 meters away. Between him and the SUV, the geometry was not good. There's a vehicle in the lot, she said, moving slow. I think I'm the target point. Get out of the car and into the building. Go through the main entrance, not the ambulance bay. The man, he can't act in a public entrance. Go now. She got out of the car. She walked, not running, because running was conspicuous, and conspicuous was a problem in a situation where she didn't know who else was watching, across the lot toward the main entrance. She kept her pace even. She heard the SUV's engine behind her, closer than it had been. She didn't turn around. The man by the ambulance bay had seen her. She could feel it without looking. She kept her eyes on the sliding glass doors of the main entrance, 20 meters away. 15. The doors opened. Marcus Holt was walking out. He stopped when he saw her. His expression shifted through several things in under a second. Surprise, a residual hostility, and then something else. Something that was reading the way she was walking, the direction she was coming from, the look on her face. "Reyes, get back inside," she said, low and fast without breaking her stride. "Right now." He read her tone the way a physician reads a patient presenting with something serious, quickly, then soberly. He turned and went back through the doors. She followed him in, the lobby, bright lights, desk staff, 2 people waiting in chairs near the window, the ordinary machinery of a hospital at 3 in the afternoon. She moved to the far side of the lobby, away from the glass front wall, and pulled out her phone. Voss was still on speaker. "I'm inside," she said. "Officers are in the lot now," Voss said. "Stay where you are." Holt was standing 6 feet away, watching her with an expression she had no frame of reference for on his face. All the authority had gone out of it. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor was uncertain. "What is happening?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. She looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say and chose the one that was true and short. "Something I was part of before I came here," she said. "It followed me." He processed that. He looked at the glass front wall, then back at her. "The soldiers from Tuesday," he said slowly. "This is connected." She didn't answer, which was an answer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she didn't expect from him. "What do you need?" She looked at him. He was not relaxed. He was not comfortable. He was a man standing in a lobby with his arms at his sides, and he had clearly not slept enough in the past few days, and there was something in his face that had not been there the last time she'd looked at it. A fracture in the professional certainty, the particular look of a person who is reconsidering a calculation they thought was finished. She said, "I need access to the ICU." His jaw worked. "You're suspended from—" "I know what I'm suspended from." She held his gaze. "Corporal Reese in the ICU. Kaminsky flagged an anomalous presentation. I need to see the chart, and I need to see the patient." Outside, through the glass, she could see a county patrol car pulling into the lot. Then another. Holt followed her gaze. He looked at the patrol cars. He looked at her. He pulled his ID badge from his coat pocket and held it out to her. She took it. "6th floor," he said. "Restricted access is the second door on the left off the elevator bank. Kaminsky's up there." She was already moving toward the elevators. "Reyes," he said. She stopped. He was still standing in the middle of the lobby, looking at her with the fractured expression. "I didn't know," he said. "What you were. What you'd—" He stopped himself, started again. "I didn't know." She looked at him for one moment. "I know," she said. "That part wasn't your fault." She turned and walked to the elevators. She did not watch to see what he did with that. Kaminsky was a third-year resident, 29 years old, with the particular tension of someone who has found something they don't know what to do with. He met her at the ICU door with wide eyes and the chart already in his hands. "I shouldn't be," he started. "Show me," she said. He showed her. She read the chart standing in the hallway outside the ICU, moving through it quickly. Vitals timeline. Lab values. The nursing notes from the crash event 1 hour ago. She read the attending physician's assessment, consistent with post-traumatic complication, and read the specific observations beneath it that the assessment was supposed to be explaining. The observations didn't match the explanation. "The troponin," she said. "I know," Kaminsky said. His original injury was blast and soft tissue, no cardiac involvement. The attending said, "I see what the attending said." She looked up from the chart. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. He was young enough that being asked directly what he thought, with the weight this question was carrying, was clearly uncomfortable. But he was also a person who'd spent the past 72 hours quietly turning over something that didn't fit. "I think the presentation looks pharmacological," he said, "not post-traumatic." She held his gaze. "The troponin elevation, the rhythm changes, the rate of deterioration. If you set aside the injury record and just look at the event in isolation, it looks like something was introduced, not something that developed." He swallowed. "I don't know how to say that in a chart note without—" "Write exactly what you observed," she said. "Exactly. No interpretation, no diagnosis, just the clinical picture, time-stamped." She handed the chart back to him. "And then I need you to access his visitor log for the past 18 hours. His eyes changed. She watched him understand. "Someone came to see him?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "That's why I need the log." He took the chart. He looked at the ICU door. Then he looked at her. "Is he in danger right now?" Kaminsky said. "Still?" She looked at the door. Beyond it, somewhere behind a curtain and a monitoring machine and a nursing station, a 20-something soldier named Reyes was stabilized for the moment, which was a different thing from safe. "Get me the visitor log," she said. He went. She stood in the hallway outside the ICU door and waited. The corridor was quiet. The overhead lights buzzed at a frequency she'd stopped noticing years ago but noticed now. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Voss. She answered. "The man in the lot is in custody," Voss said. "The vehicle left before officers could stop it. We're running plates." "Okay." "I need you to leave the hospital, Reyes." "I'm in the ICU on the 6th floor. One of the soldiers—" I know about Corporal Reyes. I have people coming." "Who authorized his visitor access?" "Someone went in to see him. I will get the visitor log." Voss's voice was firm. "You have done enough for tonight. You need to let us—" "He might not have until your people arrive." A pause. "How long do you need?" Voss said. Kaminsky came back around the corner, moving fast, holding his tablet with the screen facing her. She looked at the visitor log. There had been 2 visitors in the past 18 hours. The first, at 8:20 the previous morning, was a listed military liaison, a name that matched the facility's authorized personnel roster. The second, at 1:14 this afternoon, was listed as a family member. The name in the field was blank. Someone had logged a visitor with no name, no ID verification, 47 minutes before Corporal Reyes's cardiac event. She looked at that blank field for a long moment. "Voss," she said. "I see it," Voss said. She was already on the line. She'd been listening. "I see it. How fast can you get a team here?" 22 minutes. She looked at the ICU door. 22 minutes was a long time. "Send them fast," she said, "and get me authorization to be in that room." A silence that lasted exactly as long as it took Voss to make a decision. "You have it," she said. "Go." She pushed through the ICU door with Holt's badge and her own certainty, which was a combination that got you through most doors if you moved like you belonged. The ICU at Harlow Creek Regional had 12 beds arranged in a horseshoe, each with its own monitoring station, separated by curtains that offered the illusion of privacy without actually providing it. The charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Gill, who had been running the floor for 11 years and had the particular authority of someone who'd seen everything and was no longer impressed by credentials, looked up when she came through. "You're the suspended nurse," he said. It wasn't hostile. It was just accurate. "I'm also the person who stabilized Corporal Reyes during the intake event," she said. "And I have authorization from Major Voss at the IG's office to be in this room. She'll confirm by phone in the next 5 minutes." She met his eyes. "Is he stable right now?" Gill looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his monitoring station. "Stable. Marginal." He stood. "Bay 9. She went to Bay 9. Reyes was 23 years old and looked younger under the monitoring leads and the overhead light. A compact, dark-haired young man whose color was off in the specific way that meant his body was working hard to maintain something it shouldn't have to work that hard to maintain. His heart rate on the monitor was 89. Variable. The rhythm had a quality she didn't like. She stood at the foot of his bed and read the monitor the way she'd read thousands of monitors in worse lighting and worse conditions, and what she read confirmed what Kaminsky's chart had suggested. This wasn't a body recovering from blast trauma. This was a body fighting something that had been introduced to it, fighting it imperfectly, the way bodies fight things that were specifically designed to be hard to fight. She pulled on gloves from the dispenser on the wall. She checked his IV line, the placement, the connection, the bag hanging above it. The bag was a standard saline drip with an antibiotic add-on that matched the prescription in his chart. She looked at the line where it connected to his port. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she said, without raising her voice, "Gil, I need this IV disconnected right now and the line preserved for analysis." Gil was at her elbow faster than she expected. He looked at what she was looking at. "The line looks clean," he said. "There's a secondary port access point here." She pointed carefully without touching it. "Someone used it. Recently. The seal isn't fully reseated." Gil looked. His face changed. He reached past her and did what needed doing. Efficient. No wasted motion. The line came down. He bagged it with the gloves he'd pulled on somewhere between her speaking and arriving at her elbow. He was already reaching for the call button when she said, "Get an alternative line started and flag the attending. He needs a full metabolic panel, troponin repeat, and a tox screen that covers cardiotoxic agents." "That's not a standard order." "No," she said. "It's not." He called the attending. She stood at the foot of Reese's bed and watched the monitor and waited. His heart rate dipped to 82. The rhythm steadied slightly, or she thought it did, which might have been hope rather than data. She held the distinction clearly. Her phone buzzed. "Voss, team is 12 minutes out. How is he?" She typed back, "Stable but compromised. IV line potentially contaminated. Pulled and preserved. We need a toxicologist." Voss, "On it." The attending physician arrived 6 minutes later, a woman named Dr. Patel, who was not the same attending who had written the post-traumatic complication assessment in Reese's chart and who looked at that assessment, and then at Gil's nursing note about the IV line, and then at Joanna, with the expression of someone encountering multiple unexpected things simultaneously. "Who authorized IG office?" Joanna said. "Major Voss will confirm. Can we move the tox screen up?" Patel looked at the monitor. She looked at the chart. She was running her own calculation, and Joanna could see it happening. The point at which a physician sets aside the administrative confusion and focuses on the patient, which is the point where they become useful. "Get the labs," Patel said to Gil. To Joanna, "Walk me through what you found." She walked her through it. Patel listened the way good physicians listen, actively, without defending a prior position, adjusting as information came in. By the end, she was already making notes. Voss's team arrived at minute 14, not 12. 2 federal agents and a military medical officer who Joanna hadn't met before. A lieutenant colonel named Basara with a toxicology background, and the efficient manner of a person who had been called in from something else and was not irritated about it because the job was the job. Basara took the bagged IV line, looked at it under the light, and said, "Good catch." That was all she said about it. Then she went to work. Mart. The next 2 hours were a specific kind of controlled intensity, the kind Joanna had operated in before, in places where the margin between good outcome and catastrophic one was measured in minutes and precision. She stayed in the ICU because no one told her to leave, and because leaving would have required making a decision about it. And every decision she wasn't making about herself was energy she could put toward Reese. Basara identified the compound at hour 2. She came out of the small lab space off the nursing station with a tablet in her hand and a look on her face that was professionally composed over something harder. "Digoxin analog," she said, to Joanna and Voss simultaneously. "Synthetic variant. Oral bioavailability is low, which is why IV delivery makes sense. It's not on standard tox panels. We had to run a targeted screen." She paused. "The dose in that line, administered as a slow push over 4 to 6 hours, would have presented as hypertensive cardiac event in a patient with blast trauma history. It would not have been investigated. Voss said, "Can he be treated?" Digoxin toxicity has a reversal protocol. "We're starting it now. He'll need monitoring for the next 48 hours, but the prognosis is good given what we caught." Basara looked at the bagged line. If that bag had run another 6 to 8 hours. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Joanna looked at the Bay 9 curtain and thought about the visitor log with the blank name field. About 1:14 p.m. About a 47-minute window between an unauthorized visitor and a cardiac event. About the fact that someone had done this carefully, knowledgeably, with access to a compound that wasn't on standard panels and a delivery method that mimicked natural complication. 3 soldiers from that deployment rotation were dead. The method for a 4th had just been interrupted. "The blank visitor," Joanna said to Voss. "What did you find?" Voss had been on her phone intermittently since arriving. She lowered it now. Security footage from the ICU entrance at 1314. Male, average height, civilian clothing, ball cap. He knew where the cameras were. She paused. He signed in with a false name and a photocopied visitor credential. The original credential belongs to a real approved family visitor who was in Nevada at the time. "Prepared," Joanna said. "Very." Joanna thought about the man in the parking lot, the SUV, the 2 text messages, the level of coordination this required. Not a panicked reaction, but a structured operation running parallel tracks simultaneously. Someone watching her movements and someone accessing Reese's IV line on the same afternoon. "They knew I was at the facility on Wednesday," she said. "They moved on Reese the same day I came back here." "Those 2 things aren't separate." Voss nodded. "Which means someone in your operation has a leak," Joanna said. "Or a watcher." Voss's expression didn't change, but her silence had a quality to it. "We're aware of the possibility," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." Voss met her gaze. "I know that's not satisfying." It wasn't, but Joanna understood the shape of it. Investigations had their own physics, their own pace, and pushing them faster than they could move sometimes broke them. She let it go for the moment. She went home at 11 p.m. and slept for 6 hours and woke up to a call from Voss that arrived at 5:47 a.m. "We have Ardell," Voss said. Joanna sat up. The room was dark. "What does that mean?" "A federal warrant was executed last night. He's in custody. We're not releasing the name publicly yet. There's an ongoing operation, but based in part on your testimony and the field notebooks, the warrant was approved." A pause. "There are others. Ardell isn't the top of this." She'd expected that. A man who had given instructions to a combat medic in a sector grid 37 months ago was not, himself, the architect of something this structured and this durable. "How high?" she asked. "I can't brief you on scope right now." Voss. "I know, I'll tell you what I can when I can. What I can tell you is that the notebooks were significant. The dates, the specific documentation of what you were told to revise and by whom. That's a chain of instruction that goes up from Ardell. Your testimony and those notes put evidence in the hands of investigators that they could not corroborate before this week." Another pause, weighted differently. "You did the right thing." She sat in the dark for a moment. "There are still people who know where I live," she said. "We're addressing that. I'd like to get surveillance on your property for the next 30 days. Can I send a team today?" "Yes," she said. "Good." A beat. "Also, the hospital, the CMO, Achebe, she's been briefed at a limited level. She knows you are cooperating with an active federal investigation. She knows the incident in the ICU involved an attempt on a patient's life." "What did she say?" "She revoked your suspension this morning, effective immediately." Joanna looked at the window. The first gray of morning was pushing through the curtain edge. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt tired in a way that had accumulated over several days, and she felt something else that was quieter, a kind of settling, like a weight redistributing. "Okay," she said. She went back to the hospital 3 days later. Not because she was told to. She had not been formally scheduled yet. but because the draw of it was practical and personal in equal measure. Reyes was still there, still improving. She wanted to see the actual numbers. She got them from Kaminsky, who met her in the corridor outside the ICU, with the specific energy of a young physician who has recently experienced something that reorganized his understanding of several things at once. His troponin is normalizing, Kaminsky said. Rhythm is clean since yesterday morning. Basara said they'd continue monitoring through the end of the week, but she's confident. Good. She looked at the chart he was holding. You documented everything. The original presentation, your observations, the anomalies? Yes. Time-stamped and filed in 3 separate locations, like you said. He paused. I didn't know, when I filed them, why I was filing them in 3 locations. I know, she said. Thank you for doing it anyway. He was quiet for a moment, then, the attending who wrote the post-traumatic complication assessment was that, an honest mistake, she said. The presentation was designed to look like that. The person who designed it knew what they were doing. Kaminsky absorbed that. He was going to be a good physician, she thought. He had the right kind of discomfort with things that didn't fit. He wasn't willing to force the data into the explanation. He needed the explanation to fit the data. That instinct was the most important thing you could have and the hardest thing to teach. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. The way you work, in the mass casualty event, in there just now, looking at that IV line when nobody else... He stopped. Where did that come from? She looked at him. He was asking sincerely, not rhetorically, and he deserved a sincere answer. 6 years of not having room to miss things, she said. He nodded like he was filing that away. She walked down the hall. She encountered Marcus Holt in the elevator on the way down. The doors closed before either of them registered the other fully, and then they were in an 8x8 space with their own history between them and nowhere for it to go. Holt was holding a coffee cup in one hand and a folder in the other, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the past week doing something that cost him. Not dramatically, not in any way that would show to most people, but in the particular way of someone who has been reconsidering things that were previously settled. He didn't say anything for the first 2 floors. Then, I heard about the ICU, the line. He looked at his coffee. If you hadn't... Kaminsky flagged it first, she said. He's the one who called me. You're being generous. She didn't answer that. The elevator moved. The incident report, he said. The suspension recommendation. I've submitted an amendment. He said it to the elevator door, not to her, which told her something about how difficult it was for him to say. I wanted on record that my assessment of the situation in the trauma bay was incomplete. She looked at him. He was not a bad man, she'd decided. He was a man who had built his authority carefully and defended it reflexively, and had, in a single night, encountered something that the defense wasn't equipped for. People did not always handle that gracefully. He hadn't. But he was standing in an elevator amending an incident report, which was more than many people would do. I saw that, she said. Thank you. The doors opened at the ground floor. He got out. She got out. They went in different directions. The story broke publicly 11 days later. Not all of it. Investigations like this one revealed themselves in sections, each disclosure timed and controlled, and what reached the press in the first wave was carefully managed. But enough reached it to be significant. A senior defense contractor, Palian Strategic Group, had been placed under federal investigation for its role in a classified overseas operation that had resulted in documented civilian casualties. Several current and former military officials were named as subjects of the investigation. Among them was retired Brigadier General Terrence Ardell, formerly of the Army's Logistics and Operational Oversight Division, now in federal custody. The story cited anonymous federal sources. It did not mention Joanna Reyes by name. She read it on her phone at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, with coffee that had gone slightly cold because she'd forgotten to drink it while she was reading. She read the whole thing twice. She looked at Ardell's name, printed there in a news article on a national wire service, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something more complicated than that. She'd revised documents for him. She'd been 25 years old and 3 weeks into a deployment, and he'd sat across from her with the certainty of a man who expected compliance. And she had given it to him because she'd been afraid and tired and uncertain, and the machine she was part of was telling her to do it. She'd spent 3 years trying to decide how she felt about that choice. She hadn't resolved it. She suspected she never fully would. But she was here, and the notebooks were in the hands of federal investigators, and Ardell was in custody, and 3 people were still dead, and Reese was still alive, and those were the facts. And facts were the only thing she had to work with. She drank her cold coffee. Her phone rang. It was Warren Briggs. "You've seen the news," he said. "Yes. I wanted you to hear this from me before the formal notification comes through." A pause. "The investigation has identified 5 individuals at or above Ardell's level who authorized and sustained the cover-up from the original operation through the elimination of witnesses. Those individuals are in the process of being charged. 2 have already surrendered." Another pause. "The civilian deaths in Sector November 7 will be formally acknowledged. The families of the victims will be notified." She held the phone. "There will be a formal review process for everyone who submitted documentation during that period," Briggs continued. "Anyone who was given instructions to revise field reports under duress. The review exists specifically to differentiate between people who were complicit and people who were coerced." "I know which category I'm in," she said. "I know you do." His voice was even, but not unkind. "The review will confirm it on the record. That matters." She thought about that, about the difference between knowing something about yourself and having it established somewhere in writing by people with the authority to establish it. She hadn't thought she needed the latter. She wasn't sure she'd been right about that. "What about the contractor?" she asked. "Palion is being dismantled. Federal receivership. The contracts are being reviewed, the personnel are being investigated, and several of the principals have already retained legal counsel." A beat. "They retained excellent legal counsel, which suggests they know how significant their exposure is." She almost said something, stopped. "Keller," she said instead. "Prewitt. Tabor." A silence that was doing something. "The investigation into their deaths is active," Briggs said carefully. "I can't give you conclusions that haven't been reached. What I can tell you is that 2 of the 5 individuals charged are connected to activities that post-date the original operation by 3 years. He paused. "The legal framing is still being established." Which meant yes. Which meant the deaths were not coincidental, and the people responsible were among those being charged. Which was not closure. Closure was a word that didn't survive contact with actual grief. But it was something. It was the thing before closure, the acknowledgement that the thing was real and was being accounted for. "Okay," she said. "There's one more thing." Briggs' voice changed slightly. Less official, not informal exactly, but something more personal entering it. "Colonel Ardell's attorneys filed a motion yesterday to have certain field documentation excluded from the prosecution's evidence package. The grounds they're using are procedural: chain of custody, method of preservation, timestamp verification." A pause. "The notebooks." She sat up. "They're challenging the notebooks?" "They're attempting to. The motion is unlikely to succeed. The notebooks were photographed before being transferred, and the originals are intact and verifiable. But the challenge means that your testimony about the chain of custody, how you kept them, where they were, how they were stored from the time you wrote them, is going to be important to the prosecution's response. I'll testify to that. I know you will." Another pause. "I also want to prepare you for what that testimony involves. It will be formal. It will likely be on the record in a proceeding that becomes part of the public case file, which means your name." "I understand," she said. She did. She'd been here before in smaller ways. The particular exposure of putting yourself in front of something official and saying, "This is what I know, and I am willing to say it with my name attached." "There will be people who respond to that badly," Briggs said. "People connected to Ardell, to Palion. They've already demonstrated willingness to—" "Briggs." She cut him off, not unkindly. "I know." "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm afraid," she said. "I just do things anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "We'll be in touch about the proceeding timeline." He hung up. She set the phone down on the kitchen table. She looked out the window at the January morning, the flat white light, the frozen fields along Route 9, the mountains in the distance. She looked at the burgundy rug through the doorway to the living room, still there, still doing what rugs do. She picked up her coffee, still cold. She got up and poured it out and made a fresh cup. The formal notification from hospital administration arrived that afternoon in the form of a meeting request from Dr. Sandra Achebe, which Joanna accepted for the following morning at 10. Achebe's office had the same paperwork, the same laptop, the same window overlooking the parking structure. Achebe herself had the same directness, the same economy of expression. She gestured Joanna to the chair and put a document on the table between them. "Your suspension has been formally revoked," she said. "That's the paperwork confirming it. Your record has been cleared of the incident notation." She looked at Joanna. "I've also submitted a formal complaint to the Medical Executive Committee regarding Dr. Holt's conduct during the mass casualty event and in the subsequent administrative action. That review is ongoing." Joanna looked at the document but didn't pick it up yet. "That's a significant step," she said. "It's the appropriate step." Achebe was not sentimental about it. "Dr. Holt is a skilled surgeon. He is also someone who allowed professional defensiveness to compromise his judgment during a mass casualty event, and who then used his institutional authority to retaliate against a staff member for being more capable than he wanted her to be." She paused. "Those two things can coexist. Recognizing the second doesn't erase the first." "No," Joanna agreed. "It doesn't." "I'd also like to discuss your ongoing status here," Achebe said. "Specifically, I want to understand whether you intend to stay." The question was straightforward. Achebe asked it like it was straightforward, which Joanna appreciated. She'd thought about it. Leaving was an option, had been an option, before all of this, and remained one. Denton County was not the only place in the world, and her skills were not specific to this building. But the ICU was upstairs. Kaminsky was still figuring out what he'd seen. Priya was still here and had done what she'd been asked to do without being given enough reason to trust the ask, which was its own kind of courage. The pothole in the parking lot was still there. The microwave in the break room still sparked. "For now," she said. "Yes." Achebe nodded like she'd expected that answer. "There are things I want to change about how this department handles nursing staff expertise," Achebe said. "Specifically the scope of contribution in multi-specialty situations. I'd like your input on that. Not immediately. When things have settled." "Okay," Joanna said. She picked up the suspension revocation document and read it. She signed where indicated and slid it back. Achebe set it aside and looked at her directly. "The federal matter," she said. "The investigation. Is it going to bring anything else through those doors?" Joanna thought about the motion on the notebooks, about the preceding timeline, about the 5 individuals being charged and the attorneys they'd retained, and the specific calculation that people make when they're facing serious federal exposure and looking for anything that might reduce it. "Possibly," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that." Achebe looked at her. "I appreciate that you are." She closed the folder on her desk. "We'll manage what comes." Joanna stood to leave. "Reyes," she stopped. "The situation with Corporal Reese," Achebe said. "If you hadn't come back when you did, if you hadn't seen the IV line." She waited. "I know," Achebe said, and left it there, because she was someone who understood when a complete sentence was the wrong tool. Joanna nodded. She walked out. She was in the parking lot, 3 steps from her car, when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. Not a text this time. An email address she'd never used, the one attached to her military service record, which she hadn't accessed in 3 years, which she'd assumed was dormant. The email was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph told her that a significant piece of evidence in the federal case, specifically a digitized copy of the operational logs from Sector November 7, had been leaked to Ardell's legal team before the warrant was executed. The leak had come from inside the investigation. The investigation had identified the source. The second paragraph told her who it was. She read the name once. She stood in the parking lot in the cold morning air with the mountains behind her and the hospital behind her and her keys in her hand, and she read the name a second time. It was Delphine Voss. She read the name a third time because the first two hadn't made it feel real, and the third one didn't either, but at some point you had to stop reading and start thinking. Delphine Voss, the woman who had taken her notebooks, who had listened to 40 minutes of testimony about Ardell and Sector November 7 and the 3 weeks that had broken something open in Joanna's conscience, who had told her get some sleep and stay away from the hospital and I'll get the visitor log, who had authorized her to enter the ICU when Reese's line was compromised, who had known, before any of that Joanna had signed in at the Landers facility on Wednesday morning. She stood in the parking lot and held that sequence of facts in her mind and let them reconfigure. Because Voss being the leak didn't mean Voss had arranged the text messages. It might mean that, or it might mean something more complicated, which was that Voss had been compromised and someone else had been watching what Voss was watching, and the leak had moved in a direction Voss hadn't intended or anticipated. Neither version was good. But one version made Voss a deliberate operative, and one version made her a compromised investigator. And the distance between those two things was the difference between a decade in federal prison and a quiet internal review with career consequences. She needed to know which. She also needed to know who had sent the email. She looked at the sender address. A military domain she didn't recognize, a username that was a string of letters and numbers and resolved to nothing when she tried to search it. Someone inside the investigation who had decided she needed to know this and couldn't say it directly. Or someone adjacent to the investigation. Or someone who wanted her to take an action based on this information and had chosen the email because it would land with the weight of something verified. She didn't call Voss. She called Briggs. He answered on the second ring, which was how he always answered. "I got an email," she said. "Military domain, anonymous sender. It contains a specific allegation about your investigation." A pause that lasted exactly long enough for her to understand he already knew what she was about to say. "When did you receive it?" he asked. 3 minutes ago. Briggs, if you already know, I need you to forward it to me immediately, and then I need you to not contact the individual named until I've spoken to you again." His voice was controlled but moving faster than usual, which was its own indicator. "Can you do that?" "I'm already not calling her." "Good. Forward the email." She forwarded it. She heard him receive it. She heard him not say anything for a moment. "Where are you?" he said. "Hospital parking lot." "Go somewhere populated and stay there. I'll call you in 30 minutes. He hung up. She got in her car, started the engine, and drove 2 miles down the county road to a diner called Paulson's that she went to occasionally on Sunday mornings when the quiet of the house on Route 9 became a different kind of loud. She ordered coffee she didn't need and sat in a booth by the window and watched the road. 24 minutes later, Briggs called. "Voss is in custody," he said. She set down the coffee cup. "The allegation in the email is accurate," he said. "We identified the leak 3 days ago, but kept the circle extremely small while we verified and prepared the arrest." She accessed the digitized operational logs the night before the warrant was executed and transmitted a partial copy to an attorney connected to Pallion's legal team. "Why?" A pause. "Money. And fear." She'd had prior contact with Pallion, not operational, but financial. Consulting work, declared income, but a relationship that created leverage. He paused. When the investigation got close enough, they used that leverage. She thought about Voss's desk. The organized surface, the close-cropped hair, the precise way she'd listened, the way she'd said, "I hear you," when Joanna reported the text messages, which was a strange thing to say if you were the person who'd made the texts possible. "She called Reese's medical situation correctly," Joanna said. "She got the team there." "Yes. We believe she was not aware of the attempt on Reese in advance. The operation against him ran through a Pallion-connected channel she wasn't part of." A pause. "She cooperated with the response genuinely, which doesn't resolve her culpability, but it's worth understanding the complete picture." It didn't resolve it, but it made Voss a person who had done something corrupt and something right in the same week, which was complicated and also entirely human. "Who sent the email?" she asked. "Agent Rourke," Briggs said. "He didn't want you exposed to a Voss conversation without knowing the context. He acted outside his authority to send it, which he's aware of, and which will result in a formal note in his file." She thought about Rourke's flat Midwestern voice, his constant arithmetic, his willingness to sit in a room and listen to 40 minutes of a stranger's testimony and not once perform his attention. "Tell him thank you," she said. "I'll relay that." "What happens now?" "Now it gets complicated in ways that take time," Briggs said. "But the core of it, Ardell, the 5 individuals connected to the cover-up, and the witness deaths, Pallian, Voss, that's built. Your testimony, the notebooks, the IV line, the corroboration from the talk screen, it's built." He paused. "Your part in this, Joanna, the formal part, is not over. The testimony about chain of custody is still needed, but the outcome is not in doubt." She watched a pickup truck pull into the Paulsons' lot. An old man got out and went inside with the deliberate movement of someone whose knees had opinions about the cold. "The families," she said, "Keller, Prewitt, Tabor. Notification is being coordinated through the Army Casualty Office this week." He paused. "I thought you should know." "Thank you," she said. "Get some rest," he said. "For real this time." She sat in the booth for a while after he hung up. The coffee was bad. It was always a little bad at Paulson's, watery and over-extracted. But she kept coming back because bad coffee in a diner where nobody knew her name had been one of the small, necessary pleasures of the past 14 months, and she wasn't ready to give it up. She thought about Dario Keller, who had been 34 and had a laugh she could still remember if she tried. A big, involuntary kind of laugh that seemed to surprise even him. She thought about Helen Tabor, who had been meticulous and a little difficult, and the best at her job of anyone in that rotation. She thought about Max Prewitt, who she'd known least of the 3, and whose face she was already struggling to hold clearly in memory, which was the specific cruelty of time. They had been killed to protect a set of decisions that other people had made. Killed quietly, made to look like the body's own failure, because the people who killed them understood that the body fails all the time, and institutions are willing to believe it. The body fails all the time. Except sometimes someone catches a line with an unseated port seal at 11 o'clock in an ICU, and Corporal Reese does not become the 4th. She paid for her coffee and drove home. The formal hearing took place 5 weeks later in a federal building in Billings, and it lasted 2 days. She testified on the second day, in a room with a court reporter and a panel of 3 officials and attorneys on both sides of the table, and the particular dry air atmosphere of official proceedings that made her mouth feel slightly wrong. She wore a dark blazer over a plain shirt, which was what she had that was appropriate, and she sat in the witness position and answered questions for 3.5 hours. Ardell's attorney challenged the chain of custody on the notebooks for 40 minutes. Joanna answered each question with the same accuracy she'd used in every other room, not performing certainty but not hedging on things she was certain about. The notebooks had been in her possession from the day she wrote them to the day she handed them to Voss. They had been sealed in a box in her closet. Nobody else had accessed them. The box had her name on it in marker, which was not a security measure, but was a fact. The challenge didn't succeed. When she was done testifying, she walked out into the hallway and stood near a window for a few minutes and watched a city she'd been to twice before operate normally below her. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary mechanisms of a place that didn't know what was happening in the room she'd just left. Briggs met her in the hallway. He didn't say anything for a moment. He stood beside her and looked at the window. "You did well in there," he said. "I answered the questions," she said. "That's what doing well looks like." He paused. "The motion to exclude the notebooks will be denied. The prosecution's case is solid. Ardell's attorneys know it." Another pause. "He's negotiating." She looked at him. "He's offering testimony against the individuals above him in exchange for consideration on sentencing," Briggs said, "which is frustrating from a moral standpoint and exactly what the prosecution needs from a strategic one. It moves the charges up the chain." "Yes." He looked at the window. "The 2 who authorized the original civilian deaths and the one who directed the subsequent elimination of witnesses. Those are the people at the top of this. Ardell's testimony gets there." She thought about that. The specific ugliness of watching a man bargain with the consequences of what he'd done. The way justice sometimes ran through exactly the people it was trying to reach. It was not a satisfying mechanism. It was just the mechanism. "The families," she said. "They were notified last week." He paused. Keller's sister called the IG's office to ask about the investigation. She said she'd been told for 3 years that his death was natural causes and she'd never believed it. He looked at the city below. She said thank you to the investigation. Not by name, but she said thank you. Well, Joanna held that. She thought about what it meant to know. To have something confirmed that you'd been carrying as a terrible suspicion, unverifiable, unable to be acted on. The ambiguity of unresolved loss had its own specific weight. She'd watched people carry it in deployment, the families of soldiers, the families of civilians, the families of anyone whose death couldn't be explained cleanly or accounted for honestly. Knowing didn't fix it. But it was real in a way that suspicion wasn't. It could be placed somewhere. It could be the beginning of something, even if that something took years. Good, she said. She meant it, and it wasn't enough. And it was all there was. The sentencing proceedings ran over the following months in a process that was deliberate and legally careful and occasionally maddening in its pace. She followed what was public. She received periodic updates from Rourke, who had transitioned into the role of her primary contact after Voss's arrest, and who communicated with the same flat efficiency he'd shown in the room that first morning. Ardell received 12 years. His negotiated testimony led directly to charges against 2 senior officials who had authorized the original operation's civilian casualty suppression, men whose names had appeared in congressional committee records in entirely different contexts, men whose institutional authority had been substantial and had been used to build and maintain the kind of structure that depended on people like Joanna Reyes doing what they were told. They received 15 years and 19 years respectively. The principal who had directed the witness elimination, the person at the top of the chain that Ardell's testimony reached, was a former undersecretary whose involvement had been concealed behind 3 layers of contractor relationships. His name, when it became public, registered in ways that rippled through things she only partly understood and didn't try to fully. He received 22 years, which was not enough, which was the most the law allowed for what could be proven. Voss pled guilty to 2 charges related to unauthorized disclosure of classified material and received 30 months, which was a number that made Joanna feel complicated things she didn't fully resolve, because Voss had also gotten the team to the hospital and had been, in another version of this, a person trying to do her job under pressure she hadn't been strong enough to resist. The world was full of people who failed under pressure and people who didn't, and the line between them was not always a line of character. Sometimes it was a line of circumstance and timing, and which specific pressure landed on which specific day. Pallion's strategic group was formally dissolved. Its assets were placed in federal receivership. Its principals faced civil and criminal charges on a timeline that would extend for years. The contracts it held were transferred, audited, terminated, or restructured. The mechanisms it had used to sustain itself were dismantled component by component, which was slow and technical and entirely unglamorous, and was the actual work of accountability as opposed to the idea of it. She followed the proceedings the way you follow something that matters to you and that you can't control. At a distance, with attention, without allowing the outcome to become the center of your life. Because the center of your life still needed to be your actual life. At Harlow Creek Regional, things changed in the incremental and imperfect way that institutions actually change. The Medical Executive Committee review of Marcus Holt's conduct during the mass casualty event concluded 4 months after the event itself. The committee found that his conduct during the crisis had demonstrated inadequate leadership in a mass casualty context, and that his subsequent administrative action against a staff member had lacked evidentiary basis. He was removed from the chief of trauma surgery position and placed in a clinical role without administrative authority. He retained his privileges and his salary and his patience. Joanna had expected to feel something cleaner about that than she did. She ran into him once, in March, in the corridor outside the surgical suites. He looked older than he had in January, not dramatically, not in a way that most people would notice, but in the specific way of someone who has lost something they'd organized themselves around and hasn't fully figured out what to organize around instead. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped. "I heard the case concluded," he said. "The federal thing." "Mostly," she said. "Some of it is still going." He nodded. He looked at a point somewhere between them. I've been thinking about the intake event, he said. January, what I missed in the first 40 minutes, what you... He stopped, started again. I've been in trauma surgery for 11 years. I've handled bad nights. But I've been thinking about what my response was that morning, and I'm not comfortable with what I find when I think about it. She looked at him. He wasn't asking for absolution. He wasn't, as far as she could tell, performing anything. He was just saying a true thing out loud, which was harder than it looked, especially for people who'd spent a long time having authority make the saying of true things unnecessary. That's worth something, she said. The thinking about it. Is it? His voice was dry, not rhetorically, genuinely uncertain. It depends what you do with it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and moved on. She watched him go and thought that he would probably do something with it. Not everything, not the whole shape of who he'd been, but something. People rarely transform completely. They adjusted. They modified. Sometimes they modified enough that the adjustment became the person. It was a slow process, and it didn't make a good story, but it was the process. In April, she attended a small ceremony at the Landers facility. It was not a public event, not televised, not attended by anyone outside the specific community of people who had been connected to Sector November 7th and the families of the 3 who had died. It was a formal acknowledgement. The Army's official record of the civilian casualties in that sector was amended. The deaths were documented. The names of the individuals involved, both those who had caused them and those who had worked to expose them, were entered into the record in the appropriate categories. Keller's sister was there. She was a small, precise woman in her 40s named Adrienne, who had the same jaw as Dario, and who shook Joanna's hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake required. He talked about you, Adrienne said. In his letters. Not by name. He didn't use names. But he mentioned a medic who he said was the most competent person in the unit and also the most likely to get in trouble for it. Joanna's chest did something she hadn't prepared for. That sounds right, she said. Adrienne looked at her for a moment. I spent 3 years being told his death made sense, that it was his heart, that these things happen. Her voice was even, not fragile. She'd been holding this for a long time and had built something durable around it. What I know now doesn't bring him back, but it makes me angry in the right direction. Yes, Joanna said, that's exactly what it does. They stood for a moment in the sparse late April light, 2 women connected by a man who'd laughed too big for the space he was in and who was not here. Then the ceremony began and they turned to face it. Yet, it was Achebe who brought up the program. In May, in the same office, with the same window and the same organized desk, she set a document in front of Joanna and watched her read it. It was a proposal, preliminary, rough in places, but structurally sound, for a trauma response training program that would be embedded in the hospital's continuing education framework. The program was designed specifically for nurses and mid-level staff. Rapid triage in mass casualty scenarios, advanced hemorrhage control, airway management under resource constraints. The curriculum drew from military and civilian sources. It was built for people who had the skills but not the formal authority to use them in a crisis, and who needed both the training and the institutional backing to act when it mattered. It needed someone to run it. Joanna read the proposal twice. She looked at the section on curriculum design and recognized the framework. Recognized it because it was, in significant part, derived from the methodology she'd demonstrated in January. Someone had been watching and had taken notes of a different kind. You wrote this, Shah, she said. I wrote the administrative structure, Achebe said. The clinical content will need someone with the background to develop it properly. She looked at Joanna. This would be a formal position, additional compensation. It would exist alongside your nursing duties, not replace them. Joanna looked at the document. She thought about Kaminsky, who was going to be a good physician partly because of the things he'd seen and hadn't been able to explain away. She thought about Priya, who had done what she'd been asked without being given enough context, which was its own form of trust, and who deserved to be in a room where her instincts were developed and validated. She thought about Gil, the ICU charge nurse, who had moved to the IV line in the same breath she'd moved there, and who had not needed to be told twice. She thought about the 40 minutes on a January morning when the wrong person had been standing in the center of the room, and what those 40 minutes had cost. When do you need an answer? She said. When you have one, Achebe said. She had it 2 days later. She called Achebe's assistant, left the answer, and then stood in her kitchen for a moment with her phone in her hand, feeling the specific weight of a decision that was clean. June came to Denton County slowly, the way spring arrived this far north. Tentative at first, the ground still cold in the mornings, then suddenly and entirely itself. The fields along Route 9 went from brown to a pale, sharp green that hurt to look at in the right light. The mountains came into focus against the blue sky in a way they didn't manage when they were competing with cloud cover. She drove to work on a Tuesday morning with the windows down slightly, enough to feel the air, and parked in the lot and walked in through the main entrance and past the desk staff who had watched her be escorted out in January, and who now nodded at her with the particular easiness of people who have updated their understanding of a situation. She had a trauma training session at 10 with the first cohort, 12 nurses, 2 paramedics, and Kaminsky, who had signed up voluntarily and was the only physician in the room, which he'd been clear-eyed about. "I want to know what you know," he'd told her when he signed up. "The way you know it, not the way I was taught to think about it." She'd appreciated that. She stopped at the nursing station to check her messages before the session. Priya was at the adjacent workstation. She looked up. "Rourke called you," she said. "He left a message with the desk. He said the final sentencing in the oversight case was handed down this morning." Joanna looked at the message slip. Rourke's flat handwriting relayed by whoever had taken the call. Final sentencing complete. Full record. Call when you can. R. She folded the message slip and put it in her pocket. "Good news?" Priya asked. "I think so," Joanna said. "Yeah?" Priya looked at her for a moment. She'd never asked, over all the months, for more than Joanna had offered. She'd made space and waited, and when things had happened, she'd moved toward them rather than away. "I'm glad you're still here," Priya said. Not performing it, just saying it. Joanna looked at her. "Me too," she said. She went to the training room. The 12 nurses and 2 paramedics and 1 resident were already there, seated, waiting. She set her materials on the table and looked at the room. People in scrubs with coffee cups and varying degrees of preparedness. People who showed up every shift to a system that didn't always use what they had. People who had been told in small and large ways what their place was and had, most of them, operated within those boundaries because boundaries tend to hold when nobody tests them. She picked up a dry erase marker. "Mass casualty events have a specific failure pattern," she said. "It's not equipment failure, and it's usually not skill failure. It's identification failure. Someone in the room knows what needs doing and doesn't have the standing to say it." She wrote a number on the board. 40 minutes. That's the window in a high-volume trauma event where initial interventions determine survivability, not the second hour, not the third. She turned around. "By the end of this program, the failure I just described will not happen in this department because of you. Because you'll know what to do, and you'll know that you know it." She looked at the room. Nobody looked away. "Let's start," she said. "Ed." She called Rourke on her lunch break, standing in the parking lot with the June sun on her face and the mountains doing what they did on days like this. Sitting there enormous and indifferent and somehow, on certain days, exactly right. He answered on the second ring. "Final sentencing," she said. "All of them?" "All of them. The last 2 appeals were denied last week. The record is complete." A pause. "It's done, Reyes." She held that word. Done. Not in the sense of clean. Clean was not a word that applied to any of this. To the 3 names on the list, or to the choices she'd made or hadn't made, or to the distance between who she'd been in that sector 37 months ago and who she was standing in a hospital parking lot in Montana. None of that was clean. But it was done. The structure was dismantled. The people at the top of it were in cells or in processes that led to cells. The families knew. The record said what happened. The soldier in the ICU was alive and had been discharged and was, according to Briggs's last update, recovering at home with people who loved him. "Thank you," she said to Rourke. "For the email. In January. I acted outside my authority," he said. "I know." "You're welcome," he said. She hung up. She stood in the parking lot and looked at the mountains and felt something settle through her, Not triumph, because triumph was an emotion she'd never trusted to last, but something quieter and more durable than that. The specific peace of a person who has done what they were supposed to do, even when it took too long, even when the doing cost things that couldn't be returned. She'd come to Denton County to hide, to keep the quiet going and the past away and herself out of the center of anything that required her to be known. She understood now that the quiet had never been going to hold, not because she was important or exceptional, but because truth has a physics, and truth that has been suppressed long enough accumulates pressure, and the pressure goes somewhere, and sometimes it goes through you. She hadn't chosen to be the person it went through, but she hadn't stepped aside when it arrived. That was, she thought, the only thing she actually owed anyone. Not perfection, not a clean record or unblemished decisions, or a version of herself that had never been afraid or compliant or uncertain about what the right thing was. Just this. When the moment came and it cost something real, not stepping aside. She went back inside. The training room was down the hall. The 12 nurses and 2 paramedics and 1 resident were finishing their lunches, drifting back to their seats, picking up the materials she'd set out. Kaminsky was already there, rereading something she'd written on the board before the break. She walked to the front of the room. She picked up the marker. The nurse they hadn't taken seriously stood in front of the people she was going to teach, in the place she had chosen and kept and fought for, and began.